All right, by special request, viewer request actually, we will get into this particular article for the Thursday night study review, Transformative Social and Emotional Learning, SEL, toward SEL in service of educational equity and excellence. Let's go. All right, so this came via special request from Deb over The Reason We Learn, and she asked me to take a look at it from my perspective as a scientist who does science all the time and does studies, and to translate some of this in here. And this qualifies as one of those studies that is more of a study, in the dreaded air quotes, much like the activism one, where it was an activist guidebook for how to embed critical race theory. From before the holiday break. But I want you to take a bit note of a couple of things here, and I'm going to try and stick to that, of what I found interesting and troubling about some of this, because the first thing I want you to take note of is this is July 22nd, 2019 is when this was officially published in the Educational Psychologist, which also likely means that the authors were working on this, had to go through peer review, what have you, up to a year or so earlier than that would have been perhaps when they submitted a first draft of it. So I would actually ballpark the time that they were working on this somewhere in 2018, from summer of 2018 to winter of 2018 going into 2019, as opposed to being all done in 2019 and then published. So it's because there's time. There's the peer review, there's the back and forth, there's the usual couple of months at least of review time for some journals, anywhere from 2 weeks to a couple of months where it takes for peer review to come back when peer review is done. But 2019, I want you to keep that in mind in the context of what things you know are going on in schools, because of the timing. So the abstract. This article seeks to develop transformative social-emotional learning, SEL, a form of SEL intended to promote equity and excellence among children, young people, and adults. We focus on issues of race, ethnicity as a first step toward addressing the broader range of extant inequities. Transformative SEL is anchored in the notion of justice-oriented citizenship, and we discuss issues of culture, identity, agency, belonging, and engagement as relevant expressions of the collaborative for academic, social, and emotional learning 5 core competencies. We also point to programs and practices that hold promise for cultivating these competencies and the importance of adult professional development in making these efforts maximally effective for diverse children and youth. We conclude by offering a few next steps to further advance transformative social emotional learning research and practice. Okay. One of the things here that immediately comes to mind, of course, this is CASEL that they're talking about. That is the long name for CASEL, which is a company that primarily promotes social emotional learning in schools, has been working with a number of districts, as Deb has talked about on her channel. She can give documentation on that much more than I can. And of course, one of the authors here, 2 of the authors actually work for CASEL in Chicago. So understand that they are going to be quite possibly very interested in promoting this rather than doing something else. Okay. I would also argue that equity and excellence don't go hand in hand, because usually when equity is implemented, there's a case of tall poppy syndrome. See case in point in Oregon. The governor recently mandated that to graduate high school, you don't have to be proficient in reading, writing, math, or science, and because of inequities. So pushing for equity doesn't usually mean excellence at the same time. Well, it doesn't necessarily mean excellence happens. It's not been my experience. But let's get into this a little bit. I am going to hopefully try and blow this up a little bit, because it's a tiny bit small for me to read the way it is oriented here. There we go. That's better. Now, I'm definitely not going to read all these things. I'm going to try and stick to what's important, because I am going to try and keep this under an hour. Although much is known about the influences and impact of SEL efforts, there is still substantial gaps in our understanding of whether and in what ways SEL programs and approaches can best advance optimal academic, social, and emotional competence development of all children, youth, and adults. So, this is not necessarily an abnormal statement to see in any study. They may want to acknowledge that, yeah, we've learned a lot, but we still have a lot more to learn about certain things. That's not necessarily a bad thing. However, just in terms of a general practice, however, it is a concern when you're talking about something that is actively being implemented in schools and school districts across the country. That is a concern then at that point, and I would be very concerned also that you don't know everything about it, this method that you're doing, and what potential harms it may have, because they're framing this as all being good. They don't ever frame the bad in here. In fact, you can see that in a lot, and Deb went through this a bit on her channel too, where you can see it, that this is never framed as causing harm, this social emotional learning. It's a good thing. It's always a good thing. Let's see. This article builds on our recent efforts to help advance the research agenda for the next generation by focusing on SEL in the service of equity and excellence. Scholars and practitioners have raised important questions about whether guiding frameworks, prominent programs, and associated assessments adequately reflect, cultivate, and leverage cultural assets and promote the optimal well-being of young people, especially those from communities of color and under-resourced backgrounds. Okay. Understand something, that when you're doing a study like this, you are not supposed to be doing advocacy. And the problem with getting into equity and the postmodernist stuff is it has an activism component. So you inherently and almost immediately violate the disinterestedness norm of normative principle of science. And so this is research, help advance the research agenda for the next generation by focusing on SEL in the service of equity and excellence. For one thing, like I said, I don't think those two go together. But at the same time, this is remarkably a mess here, that they would even admit to saying, we want to do this with an eye for advocacy for particular things that are political. And believe me, they get into that. The concept of transformative SEL is a means to better articulate the potential of SEL to mitigate the educational, social, and economic inequities that derive from interrelated legacies of racialized cultural and oppression in the United States and globally. Let's see here. Oh, goodness. In essence, we argue for SEL to adequately serve those from underrepresented communities and promote the optimal development outcomes for all children, youth, and adults. It must cultivate in them the knowledge, attitudes, and skills required for critical examination and collaborative action to address the root causes of inequities. Straight out of the gate here, be questioning what they're after, because they can do this. They can write this study. And that's fine. You can write a study on a lot of different things. The question is whether or not you really want it, whether or not you view that as moral, whether or not you view this as the job of schools to be teaching your children these things. And I very much agree with the parents on this thing. Parents should have the absolute right to say, I don't want my child taught that. I do, except for some very, very, very basic things, like actually teaching this happened in history, this happened in history, this happened in history. No, absolutely, you should teach history in its fullest. But you don't have the right to teach them a value system. That is the job of the parents to do. And this is not necessarily about teaching history or teaching competency skills in certain things. Let's see. Toward this end, transformative SEL is aimed at educational equity, fostering more equitable learning environments, and producing equitable outcomes for children and young people furthest from opportunity. This includes examining biases and replacing inequitable practices with those that lend themselves to fertile, inclusive, multicultural learning environments that cultivate the interests and talents of children, youth, and adults from diverse backgrounds. Here's a fun fact about the word inclusive, by the way. Inclusive draws its roots, of course, from the word include, which is from the word includere, inclusium, in the Latin, and which exactly translated in the Latin actually means to imprison or confine. So there's a little bit of serendipity here with the kind of wokeness and the demand for inclusivity, because it is not necessarily, in the woke speak, about including people and belonging and feeling like you belong as much as a restriction, perhaps. So it's a fun thing about it. I'm not necessarily saying that this exactly is that, but the way some of this is framed, you will see that it's very much pushing for a specific worldview in here. And again, this is why I call this a study. And it's particularly basically, it's not as straightforward as the counter-narrativist strategy paper, which was an activist guidebook for how to get this done in K through 12 schools. This is more so about what you need to change in social emotional learning to get it to be what we want it to be with the postmodernist thought and critical theory. Okay, there's a couple of things down here I wanted to point out. In this article, we focus on issues of SEL and educational equity with regard to race ethnicity as a critical first step in seeking to specify how SEL might be leveraged in the service of equity for a range of minoritized people within the U.S. social system. Racialized oppression was foundational to the establishment of the United States and persists as a vexing, unresolved cluster of problems for sizable portions of the population. Racial ethnic inequalities in education are linked with other inequities such as health and wealth, and thereby compromises the life chances of these children and youth. Okay. You're going to notice that they don't have any citations for this or for this. Along with well-known projections that minority nation, yeah. There's no citation for this. There's no citation for this. When an idea becomes really dominant in a field, it's sort of absorbed as being considered general knowledge. And what usually happens with that then is that when something is considered as general knowledge, you can state it and you don't necessarily have to give a citation. And this has to do with the normative of a field in particular, whether the norms of a field, something becomes general knowledge. But because of this, things that are actually pretty contested in the public view often just get spoken out here with nothing to back them up. And this is the point I want to make, because the other thing that can happen with these is just to start saying it over and over and over again until it's in the public lexicon as fact, when that's not necessarily so. So when you see these kinds of statements out here, challenge it. Because I would be demanding, if it were me peer reviewing this, I would have demanded a citation for this, I would have demanded a citation for that. At least, if not an outright explanation. Because I do not necessarily agree, and this makes a lot of assumptions that so many things that have happened in the history cause the things that we see now. So that is something I want folks to keep in mind. Let's see, that's about Castle. Okay. In the United States and many other westernized societies, there are dominant cultural themes of individualism and materialism that suggest that the primary meaning of maturity, success, and happiness is defined by being self-sufficient, autonomous, and financially well off. That's not necessarily true of everybody, because success is not necessarily the same in this now very multicultural society that we have. But the other thing here to note is that the framing here is already getting started to say, well, these things are bad. When that is very dependent upon your worldview as to whether or not individualism is bad. So you see the moral thing there. This has in turn brought about concentration of wealth in the hands of a decreasing percentage of people across the globe, a shrinking middle class, and an expanding number of working poor and poor. The inequities and sense of unrealized material aspirations and socioeconomic precarity have social and emotional implications such as self-destructive and internecine conflict and violence that are widespread but most pronounced among boys and men of color from under-resourced communities and increasingly by low-income working-class white men. So this is all about this being capitalism is evil, essentially, is the way I interpret that, because there's primarily capitalism in a lot of Western countries, or some variant thereof. Again, this other thing right here, no citation. absolutely no citation from here on to actually to that point. And so that's one of the things I would point out there. There's actually a whole host of assumptions made in this particular paragraph with citations. This is another thing I would actually note that was weird that I noticed in here. A lot of old citations. Usually you don't want to use something that's more than 5 years old unless it's like foundational. Or you have a good reason for using it too, if there's something that's important to your argument there. But these are actually really old, at least for what I would be used to. So I'm surprised that some of this got in here, but you see like 2010, 2011, 2013. This is a good one, 2018, because remember this was published in 2019. So this is just barely, and this is just out of it. So it's it depends a little bit on the field, and so this may be okay. But I know at least for some stuff in my field, you don't want to necessarily go back to super old stuff unless there's like a chain of papers that are all related on a same topic, or there's a lot of something that is really valuable, or somebody just hasn't studied it and it's like, oh, hey, look, this hasn't been studied in forever. You can get it justify and talk about that. Or there's something that's foundational. Like there was some breakthrough however many years ago that was foundational to your work, and so on. So like me, for example, I occasionally cite, when I'm talking about climate models, the original papers from Suki Manabe, who started developing climate models in the 1960s. I would do that. That's a foundational document, and I should. But not necessarily for everything. So let's see. Schools, like other mainstream cultural institutions, tend to reproduce the social arrangements. They prioritize prevailing middle-class American culture that can be thought of as offering culturally relevant education for white middle incomes, children, and youth. Students' success is narrowly defined in these terms, and the variations from these normative patterns can result in culturally and linguistically diverse students being met with unwarranted low expectations, experiences of cultural mismatch, discrimination, microaggressions, implicit bias by peers and adults. These can be traumatic experiences which divert students' cognitive resources from learning. So, define traumatic is the note I have here. When did we have low expectations? That is one that I actually hadn't heard of. Microaggressions, just bear in mind that they can be highly subjective according to other research that I've actually covered on this channel. Microaggressions can be highly subjective, and they are not as well studied as people are saying. Engaged citizenship appears as a long-term development outcome. Okay, why is this a goal of schools? They never justify this. Always ask that question. They never justify this, and that's the thing I want to make here, is they're talking about this with respect to schooling. So you have to ask yourself the moral question, is this the role of schools? Is this what schools are supposed to be doing, or are they usurping the role of parents? I might argue with a lot of these, they are usurping the role of parents, and I will get into that more. There's a few things I noticed. Let's see. Briefly, they argued, so this was a previous study, that education aimed at promoting personally responsible citizenship and its attendant individualism, consumerism, and passivity accords with a dominant neoliberal democracy. This is the dominant model. However, a critical democracy requires education to have collectivism, productive interactionism, and authentic engagement as its goals. Accordingly, the field of SEL could aim to prepare students for not only engaged but also critical citizenship. Critical here, they mean the critical consciousness kind of approach that is dominant in postmodernist thought, in that you are critiquing and ripping apart everything for its biases and everything that is problematic, to use their words here. Critical democracy is something I only stumbled over recently. I did find a longer paper on that I have to dive into, but it's not very good. It's not a good thing here, and I do think it's an interesting philosophical argument. I do think critical democracy, with the really critical consciousness framework aspect that's involved in it, is probably really, really bad. It also doesn't consider a lot of things on how this might work here. So let's see. They talk about different kinds of citizenship in here. So participatory citizens have recognized citizenship and engage minimally, though, for example, with voting. you realize participatory here is defined with the bare minimum of what participation means. Actually, they don't define it with what could be more, like you help organize, you help be at campaigns, you go attend events where you're questioning candidates, you interact with your candidates and your politicians and elected leaders. They don't talk about that here. They just say it's minimal. Transformative citizenship is the type most closely aligned with critical democracy, as it refers to actions taken to advance policies or social changes that are consistent with human rights, social justice, and equality. I'm going to see this more and more. They think they're starting to use equality and equity interchangeably, so I question what the meaning of this word is here. Such efforts might be inconsistent with or violate existing local, state, and national laws. An acknowledgement that what they're going to push for may violate the Constitution or state civil rights laws, I think, is what we have there. That would be my take on it. Again, why is this the job of a school to promote this? Seriously, why is it the job of a school to promote that? I don't understand that, where they get into that, really. Westheimer and Kane suggested that citizenship and civic education can take three forms: personally responsible, participatory, or justice-oriented. Again, why should a school be promoting which one of civic engagement students get into? In brief, the personally responsible citizen is thought to exemplify good character by displaying pro-social attitudes and behaviors, and these youth often promote the common good. Finally, justice-oriented citizenship is concerned with institutional and system change efforts and is consistent with critical democracy. This is why I go back to critical democracy really has to do with critical consciousness and critical theory and basically upending everything kind of thing there, which is common in the postmodernist thought. If we understand SEL to be part of civic development process... Okay, hold on. Pursuing social justice implies resistance to oppressive circumstances or relations. You have to assume those exist. What if they don't? They never actually talk about that here. They always assume the oppression exists. Like before, they didn't give the citation about what they said with the United States and globally with all these different things. So it's important to understand. Viewed through the lens of Solorzano and Delgado Bernal's work, we can understand personally responsible and participatory SEL to be that which aligns with conformist resistance that offers limited or no system critique and is motivated by surviving within the existing social order. Both societal arrangements assume, uncritically, the superiority of U.S. mainstream culture and require compliance and subservience from the disadvantaged for social acknowledgement and limited access to valued resources. It prepares... Okay. In contrast, transformative SEL is consistent with the transformational resistance, as it features a system critique that is motivated by distributive social justice. It prepares youth to analyze and oppose the reality that rights and responsibilities are denied to some segments of the population and encourages disenfranchised groups to strive for self-determination within the democratic project. Why do I bring this whole long bit up here? Because that is the crux of why they're proposing transformational SEL. They argue that the old SEL, again, remember this paper was published in 2019, so think of what's going on now versus what might have been going on then. Participatory and personal responsible SEL, what was going on in schools when they wrote this, in their critique, doesn't allow for the transformational change they want to see. It doesn't allow for advocacy. It doesn't allow for changing things away from the nasty system that we have. It only allows people to conform to the system. Hence, they propose that you must have transformational SEL so that you can actually have the change you want to see and get students to make all these changes for you. Again, like I said, this is an activism thing. This is a reason why we need transformational SEL so we can help students be more civically engaged. That might be something you see. But I'm wondering right now, because when this came out was 2019, it was Educational Psychologist. You may very well have seen a change in how SEL was done in the 2019 fall school year, because remember this was summer of 2019, and I guarantee they were probably talking about their results in this paper or their results in this paper before that. So what happened? This is the thought question I have. Was there a change in how SEL was done in a lot of schools, particularly where CASEL was invested, between in the fall 2019 time period, starting about there, fall 2019-2020 academic school year, and then in 2020 and 2020-2021 and 2021 going into 2022 academic school years, was there a change associated with this where there was more of the critical theory and postmodernist thought infused into this? Because you can already tell with this one that there is a lot of postmodernist thought that is wrapped into this, and the idea that you are part of the group, you are not an individual. They look at individualism as very negative in here, and we'll see that soon enough. Let's see here. Oh yeah, no citation. Again, it prepares youth to analyze and oppose the reality. There's no citation for any of this at all. Here, they don't prove any of it. Likewise, in here, you see they never give you a definition of what justice is, and part of the reason I pushed on this is because of the change of language. James Lindsay talks about this as they trying to redefine words quite a bit here. And it's really, really interesting when they get into that, the redefinition of words. They never give you a definition of what justice is. So what is justice? Ask that question. Start asking. This is my kind of advice on this. Ask them to define it. Ask them to get very specific and give you examples of what they mean. Because I got into a whole argument with some colleagues about justice and equity being related, when in my view they're not. But we also have very different definitions of what justice is, and also very different views of equity as well. So there are things like that, and I would encourage people to be very careful with that and look at it quite cautiously with what they are doing. View these competencies. Okay, let me see. Pardon me if I'm flipping through my paper down here, because I just want to make sure I'm hitting things in my notes. Y'all don't know, I print these papers off and I scribble all sorts of notes on the papers, and then I just highlight in the doc here what I want to make sure to talk about or what I might want to talk about, and then I kind of decide on the fly a little bit here as I'm recording this. So there is that. One thing I wanted to notice here, competence in self-awareness domain involves understanding one's emotions, personal and social identities, goals, and values. One of the things, high levels of self-awareness require the ability to recognize one's own biases, that's fine, to understand the links between one's personal and collective history and identities. You notice this a lot. They try to couch it and say we're really talking about somebody's identity, but this is really about identities, the plural. And it's the really dehumanizing thing that you can just be lumped into being members of different groups and cut off there. That is something they view as self-awareness, that you are conscious of all these identities you have. Let's see. Competence in the social awareness domain involves having the critical historical grounding to take the perspective of those with the same and different backgrounds and cultures to appropriately empathize and feel compassion. Critical historical grounding is probably the critical theory version, not the version necessarily you have where you actually taught history and what happened. With responsible decision-making down here, the responsible decision-making domain requires the cultivation of knowledge, skills, and attitudes. It requires the ability to critically examine ethical standards, safety concerns, and behavioral norms for risky behavior to make realistic evaluations of benefits and consequences of various interpersonal and institutional relationships and actions, and to always make primary collective health and well-being. Yeah. So again, this is about the group and critical theory, and you're part of the larger group and we do things as a collective. There is no focus on the individual student. Keep that in mind, because there's a few things that come up here that is interesting. Who you are based on both self-definition and others' perceptions, they always assume that your identity is totally and entirely defined by others here, and that's something to bear in mind. You're totally defined by others. You have no control over who you are, apparently. Or you have very minimal control. Let's see. Despite its connection to health problems, unethical behavior, and climate change, the cultural orientation towards acquisitive individualism continues to be a dominant theme promoted within U.S. cultural institutions, including schools. So, again, individualism is bad. Being an individual is bad. For example, a communal orientation towards one family, ethnic, racial group, or community reduces psychological distress and risky behaviors and promotes a range of positive social, emotional, and academic outcomes, including school engagement, learning of academic content, and pro-social behaviors. I've been still asking. I have yet to find them. Give me an answer on that. What is pro-social? Also, is it up to the school or is it up to you, the parents, to instill values? Let's see. So I want to note something. The Framboise posited to be culturally competent within their own or other cultures, individuals would need to possess a strong personal identity, have knowledge and facility with the beliefs and values of the culture, display sensitivity to the effective processes of the culture, communicate clearly in language and the given cultural group, perform socially sanctioned behavior. Question: if you're making it all about the different identities and about your race and what have you, how can you have a strong personal identity? You're tearing apart what actually makes up a person's identity. This is why I don't like this stuff. It ends up being very dehumanizing. Oh, this was what got me crazy earlier. In their treatment of race, ethnicity, gender, and immigrant social identities, Gavani et al. Offered that social identities include centrality, importance, evaluation, regard, knowledge of group stereotypes, and awareness of discrimination. So, in other words, being aware of discrimination is what makes your identity. Like, you're aware you're being discriminated against all the time because you're of X identity. That doesn't make a personal identity at all. Awareness of discrimination does not actually make anything part of your identity. It does not have to be. I don't agree with this at all. There's a lot of moral judgments and assumptions that are made through these different studies and part of the collective literature, unfortunately, here. Let's see. Decades of research indicates that children, youth, and adults are actively and regularly grappling with the meaning of their own race, ethnicity, and the role of race, ethnicity more generally in their lives and society. Yeah, we do that all the time. That's part of life. We do that all the time. Really, it's part of life. Every person has a purpose they are supposed to fulfill, a telos, their ultimate purpose, something that gives them fulfillment. Everybody does this, but not with the meaning of their own race, ethnicity, and the role of their race, ethnicity. And where the hell is the decades of research kind of thing? I mean, are you telling me this is in here? But, no, we don't necessarily grapple with race, ethnicity as being the most important thing of our identity. We do grapple with meaning. Bear in mind, there's a lot of assumptions here about what you grapple with that are made about you, which is not necessarily accurate for all of us. I would argue this is most definitely not necessarily accurate for everyone. Although feeling good about one's racial self and being socially aware of issues in race seem relevant to all forms of SEL, centrality is transformative in the context of racialized oppression. Assimilation and humanism are consistent with personally responsible and participatory SEL, whereas oppressed minority and nationalism are transformative in nature. So these are ideologies that they talk about in here with respect to how you can respond to different things going on. Racial ethnic ideologies refer to the idealized nature of intra-group relations, then would be relevant to relationship skills and responsible decision-making. What they make a point of here is that the two called assimilation, where you blend into the dominant society, according to them, or humanism, which is quite common in Western Enlightenment-related stuff, that you're understanding and empathizing with the shared experiences of all humans, regardless of the race and ethnic background, in here. Those two things are part of the personal, responsible, participatory SEL, the old thing that doesn't transform society the way we want. But the oppressed minority and nationalism approaches are things we can incorporate in transformative SEL. The pushing towards the primacy of your group over the individual and the universal, that is typical of Enlightenment values in Western society. So, in other words, bear in mind, what they want to push more is about the group and transformative SEL, not about the human. Dehumanizing indeed. Let's see. There's a whole section in here where they actually talk about implicit bias testing. In here, teacher implicit rate. Okay, for example, there has been considerable attention to, but fairly little systemic research on teacher implicit bias. Let's see. Described as automatic cognitive associations people make between a given social group and certain feelings, concepts, and evaluations. Okay, so here, this is the point that needs to be made. This article was published before there was significant research in the second generation of tests done on the implicit association test and what have you, which found those tests to be garbage. Okay, so this is late, and you can come back and challenge folks with that and say, no, actually, they don't work all that well. And one of the biggest things they found with the implicit association test is the implicit association of something in your brain does not dictate behavior. It has no predictive value with respect to how a person behaves. I'm not going to go into that because that gets into the white fragility Kafka trap, the white fragility fallacy, as it were. I'm going to continue to call it that. Let's see. At the same time, lab-based, yes, they're talking about a positive result. So apparently, lab-based psychology research, social psychology research, studies with white participants have demonstrated that positive cues about social connectedness, shared group membership, and engaging in the authentic cultural activities of diverse groups can decrease implicit bias and increase interest in the cultures of others concurrently. Perhaps a dubious conclusion, given that implicit bias tests don't work. Let's see. This is all about intersectionality in this one section. I didn't have too much to say here. Here, I don't think. Oh, yeah, actually, this last paragraph. Given that transformative SEL advances equity and excellence, no, it doesn't. It doesn't advance equity and excellence. They have not yet provided proof of that in here, that it actually improves scores. We see the nexus of racial, ethnic identity, academic identity, and the disciplinary identification as one of the more productive lines of inquiry. For example, research has shown that positive sense of one's racial identity can buffer black students against school-based discrimination and support one's academic success. Other work has shown that students' pervasive notions of being a good student include conformity and compliance, and that this is inconsistent with the type of sustained, creative, collaborative scholarly participation required for them to approximate scientists and careers and engineers in STEM disciplines. Alignment across these aspects and elements of identity is pivotal to transformative SEL. The point that I actually made here was they've made identity and everything about it all about race, all about gender, all about those immutable characteristics in here, and trying to wrap it together with intersectionality and all this. How do you not? And then they're complaining about the current group being here about causing conformity. How are you not conforming under SEL to something that somebody's telling you, when everything in SEL is in this transformative thing being made all about race and critical theory and whether or not you're oppressed or part of a group or something like that? Yeah. There's a section here about resilience. Actually, self-regulation is featured prominently in SEL because it contributes to short and long-term adaptive, affective, cognitive, social, emotional, metacognitive, and academic development processes, modulation of stressful experiences, conflict resolution, and resilience. Social emotional learning doesn't teach resilience. At least when they're doing it in practice, it's just you're validating every emotion and why are you so upset and all these kinds of different things. Again, reason we learn for that. But, yeah, no, it doesn't teach resilience as it currently is even. Let's see. Okay. This is interesting in here because they gave a long thing about what agency is. And in reality, when I was looking up the definition for having agency, it means having independent capability or ability to act on one's will, rather than all of this kind of stuff here. And you notice they never mention independent action of something in here, that it is about an individual when you're talking about having agency. Proposed moral agency. They're talking about a different author. Proposed moral agency that refers to a self-reactive process through which people refrain from wrongdoing toward others and the proactive engagement of inhumane behavior. The question I would have about that is, does that include microaggressions, which are highly subjective, and you don't necessarily know when somebody is going to be offended. Let's see. Given our contention that SEL is a civic enterprise, we include literature on political agency or efficacy, which refers to an individual's belief in his or her own knowledge and skills to act socially and politically. Again, so they're referring to this as civic engagement. They want people to be activists. This is why this is not a study necessarily, because it's interested in promoting political advocacy, and perhaps political advocacy that they want necessarily. There's no necessary guarantee that they would be after something who was more conservative necessarily here, the way this has gone. Let's see. What is pro-social behavior? Can't be an individual. Yes. Collective efficacy is an essential transformative SEL competence. You can't act as an individual. They don't like that with SEL, with transformative SEL anyway. With the older SEL, you probably could have argued that it was about, a social emotional competence for the individual. This is not. And a lot of this whole section is all about that, whether it is talking about collective action. But one of the things that caught my attention here is this last section of here where they're actually talking about social family, maybe useful construct for understanding social family community partnerships to advance educational initiatives such as systemic transformative SEL. Such collective efficacy can be built on individual civic engagement by creating and leveraging social bonding capital. So this is all about understanding how these things interact, and I don't necessarily trust that it's a good thing for the family necessarily with these kinds of things here, judging from the material, but that is perhaps my own bias. Something with belonging here, I have never seen anybody in any of these papers give a good definition of what they mean by belonging. So again, that is something you can always continue to ask. Okay. Research also points to increased racial awareness and a decline in public regard, a component of ethnic racial identity among students of color as they grow older. This suggests that students may be increasingly aware of negative views that adults and peers hold of their ethnic racial group. Is it that? Or, because they don't actually talk about it here, they're making the assumption, could it also be that you've told them that people feel this way about you? Directly and indirectly. That's the thing here. You're going to realize there's more to it than that, and they're making assumptions about what these are at this point. They did not actually give a citation for this. This suggests is here. That's an assumption. Belonging implies not only recognition, but also full involvement in meaning making and the building of relationships and institutions. What the hell do you mean by meaning making? That we should find meaning from the collective? It's not necessarily very meaningful at all, as far as I can tell. Civic engagement has emerged as a focal aspect of human development in the last 15 years. Civic engagement encompasses a range of knowledge, values, including believing here that civic engagement is super important. Less attention is given to early manifestations of transformative justice-oriented citizenship, active engagement in institutional and system change efforts, which is to say they don't know how any of this will actually work. Anyway. Critical self and social analysis are pivotal aspects of socio-political development and connote to an evolving understanding of cultural, economic, and political systems, how these systems shape society, and how societal definitions impact one's own status within society to guide individual and collective sense of efficacy, described earlier, and actions to ameliorate oppression and injustice and realize liberation. Liberation beliefs right there. Let's see. So now they've gone through some of these different things. These are programs and approaches they would recommend. Evidence indicates that SEL programs reduce risky behaviors and improve desired, personally responsible, and participatory social and emotional attitudes and behaviors. A second key finding is that extant SEL programs impact positively on academic outcomes as represented by improved grades on scores and standardized tests. Prove it. Where's the damn citations? They never cited any of it. They don't have any proof of this. They have no proof. I don't see a whole heck of a lot of citations in here. In terms of academic outcomes, it is less clear the degree to which such programs incorporate or leverage more constructivist approaches to learning, advanced in the learning sciences, and linked to 21st century. No. There's no evidence that SEL improves academic outcomes. I'm sorry. They didn't provide it. They didn't provide anything in here. And this is, again, point. No, you can't just say it and expect me to believe it. Prove it. There are general agreement that today's educational processes should support the development of 21st century skills that include self-directed and collaborative activities. Self-directed and collaborative, that is student-led kind of things here. In other words, which is to say, students should run everything. How can they run everything when they haven't learned anything? How will they know what they're doing? Okay, one of the implications that they have for schools attuned to diverse students is individualized supports that include multi-tiered systems of support, extended learning opportunities, and access to integrated services. Everything they talk about with identity is respect to what group you're talking about. None of this can't be individualized. With the thing here that they're talking about. They made a contradiction in their own paper here. They talk so much about your group identity, your social identities, the dehumanizing nonsense that is. And here you end up with individualized supports as one of the implications of doing all this. No, you can't have individualized supports because you're looking at everybody as members of groups. You're not really interested in a lot of it here. So it's fascinating with this, how far they go. Because academic, social, emotional competence, and are deeply intertwined. No citation there. Let's see. Benefits from positive development relationships characterized by warmth, consistency, attunement, reciprocity, and joint activity, including sharing and transfer of power and scaffolding of learning. Always about power. When you see that it's always about power, there you go. Power sharing can foster racial and academic identity, development, agency, and a sense of belonging. Again, prove it. No citation. This aligns with Mira and Morell's notion of teachers as civic agents in a critical democracy. Further, this is consistent with our contention that SEL is best understood as a civic development enterprise and that schools and classrooms are mini polities. Okay, in other words, right here, this is where you get back to it again. The school, these folks who are part of this study, view the school as being a place for political development in here. This is why, what is the role of the school? You need to push back very strongly and answer the question for yourself. What is the role of the school? What is the role of the parent? It is not the school's job, in my view, to develop the values that students should have. It's not the school's job at all. It's not the school's job to push a political agenda on the students. And you better be damn careful of that. It is the parent's job to push on a lot of these critical issues. Let's see. So here they talk about the typology of patterns of youth-adult relationships applied to student-teacher. Student-teacher. What happened to the parents' involvement here? Again, they're ignoring the parents. Just bear that in mind. They're ignoring the parents right here. Youth have a voice, are active participants, share control in pluralistic relationships between teacher and student. Transformative SEL requires a pluralistic relationship that might foster youth autonomy and lead to social change. In other words, in a pluralistic relationship, we let the students run things, we validate everything, and we let them go to town demanding change and everything. There is general consensus that culturally informed content and instructional processes reflect the best of science and the best science of learning and development as they can afford cultural well-being, identity, and safe learning environments that can result in optimal opportunities for academic and social emotional learning. Does it reflect the best in practice? Because if there's a general consensus among the scholars, that's fine. But they've never shown any of the good things with respect to the real world data. You gotta realize this is all pushing something new. This is not saying anything about, okay, what is this? Has this worked in practice? Does it actually work? Does it have harms that we need to acknowledge, which they're not acknowledging in here at all? This is all about pushing social emotional learning. There is no acknowledgement of the other side. What is the negatives? They never even bother to look at the negatives. Let's see. This is all about power right in here again. Nothing about the truth. Culturally responsive teaching. Say hi to CRT, as it were, and it's another form where they've been thinking about it for a while. So from this, you might argue that critical race theory and culturally responsive teaching are not the same thing. I kind of doubt that, given some of the phrasing in here, where it says also challenges racial and social cultural stereotypes, prejudices, and racism and other forms of intolerance, injustice, and oppression. It encourages change, agents for social justice and academic equity, which is exactly what critical race theory does. As an ideology, it is an activist ideology. No examination here. They're talking about the relationship in here between culturally relevant teaching, or CRT, in this thing, and SEL, and they actually show absolutely nothing about why either one is good in this whole thing. No examination of being good. Let's see. Existing literature indicates that explicit instruction around issues of identity can have positive impacts on student outcomes. Britton Lloyd Williams. Okay. Existing literature indicates. And guess what? They only talk about a study. A study. No, you don't talk about a study when you're talking about existing literature and doing a review in here in part. So I'm sorry, no, that doesn't count. In a quasi-experimental study, the researchers found that fifth graders in the intervention group, they're talking about that particular study, as compared to the comparison group, more strongly endorsed Afrocentric communal values and reported feeling more positively about being Black and believing that Black is a positive attribute. Assuming the values or assigning the values of a group of people is what I would worry about with that study, because that's highly immoral to me. Although the youth of color reported higher exploration and sense of clarity about ethnicity, race over time, the authors report expected program effects on identity exploration for all. Expected program effects. Yeah, there's no sense of self here. It's all about your race, your ethnic and racial identity with this kind of thing. The use of CRE, culturally relevant something, I believe, in history and social studies has been connected to heightened awareness of power and political movements and effects of racism. Two things. A, why is it all about power when it needs to be talking about the truth? B, why are you teaching them what to think instead of how? And C, is this really the job of schools? Again, parents, is this really the job of schools to be teaching all this? You better answer that question real fast here is my thought on that. Okay, the racism lessons, so they're talking about an example here. The racism lessons included about discriminatory experiences endured by famous Blacks, whereas the control condition offered no such information. Among white children, those in the racism condition reported more positive racial attitudes, greater valuing of racial fairness, and greater racial defensiveness and racial guilt than the peers in the control condition. In other words, you were making the kids feel bad for something they didn't do, which was highly frickin' immoral. In my purview, this whatever particular study, this particular one here did that in 2007. So you think about that, 15 years old. That's highly immoral on so many levels that they did that. Huge amounts of emotional manipulation. Let's see. Arison and Laughter's reviews suggest that CRE is associated with indicators of academic motivation, such as increased content interest and increased confidence and facility with content discourse and test taking. Nothing about mastery. After field trip, again, nothing about mastery. There's nothing about mastery. Where they actually get to mastery here, the only thing that they actually show that has mastery improved with it is actually in English language arts, of all things. Nothing about it in STEM. Let's see. CRE educators are replacing deficit. I'm going to try and skip ahead because I know I am running long on this a little bit. But I will give it to you and expect you... I expect you to read this article. No, I don't expect you to read this article. I'm trying to summarize it for you in my review of this study. And I may well lose my voice doing it. This is an interesting little bit that I stumbled over here. CRE educators are replacing deficit with more affirming views of students and communities, understanding why and how culture and difference are essential considerations, willingness to conduct a critical analysis of textbooks and other materials, making pedagogical connections within the teaching context, and anticipating that there will be critics of culturally responsive teaching. They don't want you to critique it, but you should. You should on that one. Duncan Andrade offered 5 pillars of effective culturally relevant practice, being critical consciousness of their students' potential as change agents, their sense of responsibility to the community. Neither of those things belong with teachers considering that in the classroom. It's not their job, the teacher's job, to push kids to be political activists for anything, in my purview. And I'd be pissed as a parent if I found a teacher doing that myself. Oh, by the way, this guy here, some suggesting book clubs and what have you, curriculum labs, professional learning, provide a means to develop a greater culture. This guy, Blaisdell, right here, that's the author of The Counter-Narrative is Strategy, paper that I reviewed before the holiday break. Critical race theorist right there. Let's see. Student-centered and student-led approaches suggest that such approaches, instructional approaches such as project-based learning and youth participatory action appear to have potential for fostering social, emotional, academic processes and outcomes for diverse students and adults. Suggests that reading such approaches are aimed at developing critically informed and engaged students and are thus consistent with transformative SEL. Again, is that what you want as a parent here? And that is what you need to consider because that's what they're trying to do. Project-based learning encourages collaborative problem solving, but is represented in... Okay, they're looking at collaborative problem solving as a reason for having social emotional learning and transformative and social emotional learning because we are engaged in more cross-discipline research and the whole works there. So there's a need for cross-discipline collaboration, working with a lot of people who don't share the same beliefs as you do, and that's why they argue that you need SEL to do this. Probably going to have the opposite effect, the way they're going with considering groups and showing everybody so different and who's oppressed and who's not, and basing that on race, gender, ethnicity, and all the rest. But it's represented in the CASEL program guide based on improved academic outcomes in high school economics class. The key success skills for students in school, the workplace, and as citizens include social and emotional competencies such as the ability to think critically, manage themselves effectively, and work well with others. These success skills are also referred to as 21st century skills or college career readiness skills. These skills should be taught. Wow, one hell of a typo. Should be taught in all projects and only through the acquisition of content knowledge. They don't mean when they say thinking critically here, they don't mean that in the sense of Western style critical thinking or Enlightenment values style critical thinking, where you actually question just about everything. No. They mean that in the terms of problematizing and ripping things down, I don't think. Well, I think right now. So STEM, they're talking about this with respect to STEM, and there's a couple of different studies they have here with respect to STEM. One of the things I picked out here that I want you to bear in mind is actually none of these actually used SEL, from what I could find in here when I was looking at them. None of them actually used SEL, but they are arguing to incorporate SEL in project-based learning. Project-based learning does have its merits, that you can actually do a project through a semester and actually learn how to do something and learn the content knowledge that way. I'm not devaluing that, but I don't think SEL is going to help in here, and this might actually be an interesting case of that. I would love to see some projects where SEL is done and where SEL is not done, and which one actually had the better academic result. Findings suggest that students can rely on prior experiences on notions of future identities to motivate them to engage in disciplinary practices and thereby more fully adopt a disciplinary identity. I don't have an identity as a scientist. A scientist is part of my complete whole identity. Thank you very much. So I don't think that's a helpful way to develop a sense of self, is to have yourself partitioned off. Yeah, and they don't teach logic, do they? YPAR is the Youth Participatory Action thing, and I cannot remember the last letter of the acronym, so I'm just going to call it YPAR from here. Youth-centered form of community-based participatory research, which is used... It's not research. I read this further on down. It's not actually research. Used frequently in public health, social work, and community psychology to actively engage underserved children, youth, and adults in identifying and addressing real-world problems through an iterative research and action process. Community-based content. Okay. Kids haven't been around that long. Use of social science research skills positions youth as experts, critical consumers, and producers of knowledge about their lived experiences. Kids haven't been around that long. They don't have a whole lot of experiences. So no, you can't really position them as experts about a whole lot of anything. They're arguing here that adults shouldn't be the authority, that they should be co-learners. Wrong. They should be the authority because adults do have a lot of experience in here. Adults should not be abdicating their authority to be teaching kids. Students, where is it? Uh-oh, did I miss it? I did. Students in YPAR condition report higher levels of social political skills, motivation to influence their schools and communities. Okay. What about the mastery part of it? Are students actually mastering anything? Let's see. Toward this end, teachers use three signature practices of shared power, critical conversations about race and identity, and participatory action research. Although all were able to complete action research projects that culminated in presentations to relevant policymakers, Kirshner shed light on the ways in which teachers struggled with launching and sustaining this time of transformative effort. These included, for example, structural challenges associated with an overemphasis on testing and administrators' discomfort with students' critiquing of the school. There were also instructional challenges that included teacher experiences of vulnerability and loss of power, student apathy, and discomfort with discussions of race. Implied here is a critical need for teacher identity work and for the development of personal and collective efficacy to advance transformative SEL. In other words, teachers are running into problems getting this in there. And so we got to do this other thing over here to help it get through the system. This is going to run a little long today. I'm sorry, I don't know that I can keep this under an hour because there's a lot of stuff in here that I wanted to mention with it. And mostly they get into huge generalizations. Of course, they do the dehumanizing thing of saying the dehumanizing assumption that you have identities rather than the singular self of identity. You need to build a good sense of self, not a good sense of racial identity. Here. All right. Oh, we're in the conclusion section. All right, we're almost there. Lots of stuff in here. Again, this is a study, not a study. This is an activism guidebook, and this is a suggestion for what schools need to be doing to actually change society effectively, to be more politically, get students to be more politically engaged and more about the collective rather than the individual and have a good sense of individual self. Not good things here, not good things. Our article represents an effort to establish and flesh out transformative SEL as an approach that we believe to have merit if researchers, practitioners, and other stakeholders are interested in advancing equity and excellence in education. Again, equity and excellence do not go together. They really don't. But the other thing is this is not about doing research. This is about advancing an agenda. This whole study has just been about advancing an agenda because they haven't said anything negative about SEL in the slightest. They haven't pointed out any of the problems that SEL has or any things it may cause. Maybe because they just don't have enough data and not enough studies have been done. But at the same time, there's not anywhere near enough acknowledgement of that. I don't think. Let's see. As we further sharpen conceptualization of multiple forms of SEL, we will need to turn attention to how these advances are represented in, for example, the CASEL framework. In many respects, this article represents an opportunity to add additional substance and nuance to these deliberations. With district partners, we are pursuing action research on development of proposed transformative social and emotional competencies, with a particular emphasis on issues of identity, agency, belonging, and collaborative problem solving. Okay. I want to mention this here because, as I said, this article was published in 2019. So they've been doing this since the time they published the article, if not before. Think about which districts CASEL is working in and whether or not SEL is actually transformative SEL that they've implemented. That is the question that needs to be answered. Is it SEL, the personal and participatory as they highlighted here, or is it the transformative one that is pushing everyone toward being part of a collective rather than actually developing a good sense of individual self? And although we highlighted ethnic racial identity in this article, class and gender identity are also critical aspects of how students and adults conceive of themselves. Are you sure? It's another one that has no citation to it. Because not all of us think on terms of race, class, gender, and what have you. Anyway. This was the one I wanted to get to. The literature points to a number of approaches, programs, and practices that are consistent with transformative SEL as they help advance aspects of transformative social-emotional learning social-emotional competencies for children, youth, and adults. Of course, adult SEL, so SEL for adults, is critical to any transformative SEL effort. The prospect of widespread racial bias means that pre- and in-service professional development efforts associated with this form of SEL must include critical content and experiences aimed at humanizing underserved students and affirming their rights and assets in co-constructing an equitable and excellent educational experience. Which is to say, they think there's widespread racial bias everywhere. Therefore, we must re-educate the adults. They said the prospect of, they have absolutely no proof. They have no proof of widespread racial bias. If they do, I want to see this citation and study. I want to review it. But they actually don't have it. They really absolutely do not have it. Seek insights into the ways in which power sharing opportunities might occur. They presume that the power sharing thing is a good idea. Here, they presume that in here. However, they are more intentional about positioning students as experts in their own lived experience. Again, students don't have a whole lot of expertise because they are students. They haven't lived a whole lot to have a whole lot of experience. And no, not lived experience, experience. They don't have a whole lot of experience in anything. All right, the closing paragraph here. We will read this in full. Transformative SEL requires explicit critical examination of the root causes of racial and economic inequalities to foster the desired critical self and social awareness and responsible individual and collective actions in young people and adults. Programs and approaches that focus on identity development and or systematic efforts to integrate issues of race, class, and culture into the academic content can have greater utility to the degree that they advance aspects of identity that comport with transformative SEL. Although considerable attention is given to historically disenfranchised groups, meaningful and sustainable change requires transformations in the way in which those experiencing relative privilege understand themselves and their role in ameliorating inequities in interpersonal and institutional contexts. Which means they want to change the way everybody thinks about themselves to match what they think is right. The limited evidence on this seems mixed at best. Project-based and youth-led or action-oriented approaches may have the greatest purchase as they provide a context for children, youth, and adults to work together to synthesize and cultivate critical academic, social, and emotional competencies to include an iterative cycle of action, reflection, and refinement of strategies they enact to realize collective well-being in the broader national and international context. Okay. All of this was funded in part by the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative and by the University of Michigan. Now, one of the things that has to happen with the different things here, and pardon me while I fix my papers, is often you can find where these grants were listed. And I did actually go look on the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative's website. Because the unfortunate thing is they didn't include a grant number here, so I can't track it down by the exact grant number, but I can tell you how much CASEL got from the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. In 2018, on the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative gave $750,000 to CASEL. In 2019, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative gave $1.5 million to CASEL. My guess, probably for the implementation of social emotional learning. Or perhaps now, since it's after this article was written, transformative social emotional learning. I would actually argue that what you've spotted now in schools is the transformative form of social emotional learning, not the personal and participatory form of social emotional learning that they argue in this doesn't allow for societal change that they want. So, again, this is another prime example of something that is a study, with air quotes, here, rather than a good quality study that actually answers a research question. This does not. This basically goes on about how this thing should be incorporated if we want to advance equity, and not excellent, because excellence doesn't go along well with equity from my experience. I could be wrong. I will always leave myself open to being wrong on that, but I am quite doubtful of that, given that it tends to result in some people being shot in the foot because they achieve very well. Anyway, so let me know what you think. This is the long Thursday review. I'll put this up a little earlier than normal, just so everybody has a chance to watch it before the 8 o'clock live chat on Locals. And that's it for now. Again, this is a horrible study, so my recommendations on this one, challenge the generalities that you might see come up in some of these studies, because they didn't cite a whole bunch of things that they didn't cite papers. They just assumed this is true, so we're just gonna write it in here, kind of thing. So, you got to look at that. Challenge the generalities. Challenge the conception of identity that they have, because they conceive identity as being identities. You're part of a group. You're not an individual, and you're not a human. You're not collective to the universal either. So, yeah, yeah, that's the dehumanizing individualism, kind of the dehumanizing thing, that you're not an individual and that individualism is bad. Which, individualism is quite good. At least from my purview. So, and aside from that, also bear in mind that they actually don't, this article in particular is entirely promotional of SEL. It doesn't show any of the bad things that SEL has done or will do. So there's all of that. Alrighty, I'll see you on the live chat and locals soon enough if you're a supporter. If not, you might want to be a supporter. So consider coming over and joining us as a supporter on locals, not just for free members. This is for supporters only. So until next time, hit the like button on the way out the door if you like the video, subscribe to the channel, share the video, comment on the video, all that good jazz. And until next time, I'm Adrian, and I hope you stay curious, my friends.